Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Vortigern Shakespeare hoax. Our story begins in the winter of 1794, amidst a London that breathed in the heavy, yellowed fog of the Thames. Imagine the city as it was then, a labyrinth of cobblestones and soot, where the lamps flickered with a low, oily light, casting long, distorted shadows against the brickwork. We find ourselves in the heart of the legal district, at a place known as New Inn. Here, the air is thick with the scent of damp wool and the sharp, metallic tang of iron gall ink. Inside a cramped, dimly lit chamber, a young man of 18 years sits at a heavy oak desk. His name is William Henry Ireland. He is a legal apprentice, a clerk whose days are measured by the slow, rhythmic scratch of a quill across parchment. The room is silent, save for the occasional pop of a coal in the small fireplace and the distant, muffled rattle of a carriage passing on the street outside. William Henry is a solitary figure, his silhouette framed by towering shelves of leather-bound ledgers and dusty bundles of legal deeds, their wax seals glowing like cooling embers in the twilight. William Henry was a young man adrift. To his teachers, he had been a dullard, a boy who could not master the classics and who frequently felt the sting of the cane. To his father, Samuel Ireland, he was a disappointment, a pale reflection of the intellectual brilliance Samuel so desperately craved. Samuel was a man consumed by a singular, burning passion. He was an antiquarian, a collector of curiosities who lived in a grand house on Norfolk Street. To walk into Samuel's home was to step into a cabinet of wonders, filled with paintings by Hogarth, fragments of mummy shrouds, and rare books that smelled of centuries past. But above all these treasures, Samuel worshipped one man, William Shakespeare. He called him the great bard, a literary deity. Samuel would often lament, with a heavy sigh that filled the drawing room, that he would give half his library just to lay eyes on a single scrap of paper touched by the poet's hand. He spoke of Shakespeare's missing manuscripts as if they were holy relics, lost to the mists of time. William Henry watched his father's longing from the periphery, feeling the cold weight of his father's indifference. He was a son who felt invisible, a shadow in a house built of grand ambitions and ancient paper. In the quiet hours at New Inn, when the senior lawyers had departed for their clubs and the candles burned low, William Henry found himself alone with the archives. The office was a treasure trove of the unwanted, old rent rolls, forgotten leases, and discarded deeds dating back hundreds of years. He began to run his fingers over the vellum, feeling the peculiar, greasy texture of the ancient animal skins. He noticed how the ink on the older documents had faded to a soft, rusty brown, and how the edges of the paper had frayed into a delicate, lace-like fringe. It was here, in the stillness of the legal chambers, that a small, dangerous idea began to take root. He started to practice. He would take a blank flyleaf from an old book or a scrap of parchment from a discarded rent roll and try to mimic the flowery, intricate handwriting of the Elizabethan era. He studied the loops of the letters, the way the ink pooled in certain strokes, and the peculiar, archaic spellings. His hand, once clumsy in the classroom, became steady and precise. He was not just copying letters. He was learning to breathe life into a ghost. The silence of the office became his sanctuary, a place where he could transform from a lowly clerk into a master of deception. The process was a slow, meticulous alchemy. To create the illusion of age, William Henry realized that fresh ink was far too vibrant, far too honest. He began to experiment with chemicals, mixing his ink with tobacco, water, and bookbinder's liquid to dull its luster. He discovered that if he held a freshly written page over a low candle flame, the heat would bake the ink into the fibers, giving it that brittle, centuries-old appearance. He learned to use coal ashes to smudge the edges, mimicking the accumulated dust of a forgotten trunk. One afternoon, he found a facsimile of William Shakespeare's signature in one of his father's books. He stared at the wobbly, uneven letters, the signature of a man who changed the world. He traced it again and again until he could reproduce the bard's mark with his eyes closed. He decided to create a deed, a mortgage agreement between Shakespeare and a man named Michael Fraser. He found a piece of parchment from the reign of King James I, a document that already bore the weight of history. With a trembling hand and a heart hammering against his ribs, he began to write. He forged the terms of the lease, the names of the witnesses, and finally, the signature that his father would recognize anywhere. It was a bridge of ink and lies, built to span the distance between a lonely son and an obsessed father. On the evening of December 16, 1794, William Henry arrived at the house on Norfolk Street. The air was biting cold, and the windows of the house glowed with a warm, inviting amber. He carried the forged deed tucked inside his coat, the parchment stiff against his chest. He found Samuel in his study, surrounded by his beloved books. With a carefully rehearsed story, William Henry presented the document. He claimed he had met a mysterious gentleman, a man he referred to only as Mr. H., who possessed a vast, disorganized chest of family papers. This Mr. H., he said, had allowed him to sift through the contents and keep whatever he found. Samuel's hands shook as he took the parchment. He held it up to the candlelight, his eyes widening as he traced the signature of William Shakespeare. The room seemed to grow still, the ticking of the grandfather clock the only sound in the air. Samuel did not see a forgery. He saw a miracle. He saw the very thing he had spent his life searching for. For the first time, he looked at his son not with disappointment, but with a profound, ecstatic awe. He praised William Henry, his voice thick with emotion, calling him the discoverer of a national treasure. In that moment, the lie was sealed. The clerk's shadow had finally touched the sun, but the heat of that light was about to become far more intense than he ever imagined. The success of the first forgery was intoxicating. To see his father's face transformed by joy was a reward William Henry had never known. But with that joy came a new, insatiable pressure. Samuel, now convinced of his son's luck, began to beg and plead for more. He was certain that the chest of Mr. H. must contain other treasures, letters, poems, perhaps even a lost play. William Henry had set a machine in motion that he could not stop. He returned to his desk at New Inn, the smell of tobacco, water, and old parchment now a permanent part of his life. He began to dream of more elaborate fabrications, deeper lies that would weave Shakespeare even tighter into the fabric of the Ireland family. The basement of the legal office became a factory of the past, where the 18th century was slowly being rewritten in the ink of the 16th. As the fog continued to swirl through the streets of London, the young clerk realized he was no longer just an apprentice. He was the guardian of a ghost, a creator of history, and a prisoner of his own success. The first deed was merely the beginning of a descent into a world where the line between truth and fiction would blur until it vanished entirely. For now, however, the house on Norfolk Street was filled with a newfound light, unaware that the foundation it rested upon was made of nothing more than smoke and shadows. The law office where William Henry spent his long, listless days was a silent tomb of legal records and forgotten claims. It was a place of heavy mahogany, the scent of cooling wax, and the relentless, rhythmic scratching of quills against paper. In this atmosphere of dusty tradition, the young man found the raw materials for his grand deception. He began to hunt through the stacks of ancient, neglected volumes in the office's dark corners, seeking those precious blank pages known as flyleaves. These were the unprinted sheets found at the beginning and end of 17th century books, paper that had already aged for 200 years in the damp London air. With a steady hand and a razor-edged blade, he would carefully excise these slivers of the past, feeling the brittle resistance of the fibers as they gave way. The paper was thick and irregular, carrying the faint, sweet musk of old wood and slowly decaying linen. Each sheet was a stage waiting for its ghost. When the supply of flyleaves ran thin, he turned to old rent rolls and property deeds, cutting away sections of blank parchment that had survived since the reign of King James I. The texture was different from paper, cooler, more resilient, like dried skin that had forgotten the warmth of life. He would hold it up to the weak, gray sunlight filtering through the office windows, tracing the irregular veins and the yellowed edges that only centuries of quiet neglect could produce. To the senior partners, it was mere waste, but to the young man with a secret, it was a canvas of infinite, dark possibility. Then came the delicate alchemy of the ink. Standard ink of the 1790s was too black, too glossy, and far too fresh for the eye of a collector who understood the slow, fading ways of history. To create a liquid that spoke of the past, William Henry visited a local bookbinder and, under the guise of an apprentice's curiosity, learned the secrets of aging a manuscript. He mixed his concoction with specialized chemicals and diluted the dark iron gall until it looked like a pale, murky tea. But the true transformation happened in the presence of heat. In the dead of night, with only a single candle casting long, dancing shadows against his bedroom walls, he would hold the wet parchment just inches from the flickering flame. He watched, his breath held in a tight, anxious knot in his chest, as the pale liquid began to react to the warmth. It would deepen into a rich, scorched brown, the edges of the newly formed letters curling and darkening, as if the sun of 1610 had baked them for 100 years. The air in his small room would grow heavy with the sharp, acidic tang of the chemicals and the faint, unmistakable smell of singed vellum. One mistake, 1 second too close to the dancing wick, and the entire deception would go up in a plume of acrid smoke. But the danger only added to the intoxication. He was not just writing, he was summoning the very texture of time, one scorched syllable at a time. The simple signatures soon felt inadequate for the legend he was building. He began to draft letters, weaving a complex web of relationships that the world had long thought lost to the Great Fire of London and the creeping dust of the centuries. He composed a letter from Queen Elizabeth I herself, a note of thanks to the playwright that sparkled with the stiff, royal grace of the Tudor age. To ensure the handwriting appeared distinct and regal, he practiced the Queen's florid, jagged script until his wrist ached with the effort. When it came time to write a response from the Earl of Southampton, he realized the script must look entirely different from that of the bard. In a stroke of desperate genius, he switched the quill to his left hand, forcing his muscles to move with an unfamiliar, clumsy elegance. The resulting letters were shaky and strained, yet they possessed a strange authenticity in their imperfection. He even went so far as to include a lock of dark hair, supposedly from Shakespeare to his beloved Anne Hathaway, tied with a fraying silken thread. He also forged a profession of faith, a document that firmly established Shakespeare as a devout Protestant, satisfying the religious anxieties of his own time. Each new discovery was more daring than the last, as if he were testing the limits of human belief. He was no longer just a clerk in a law office. He was a silent puppeteer, moving the hands of monarchs and masters from across the veil of time, watching as the ink dried on a history he was rewriting by candlelight. The house in Norfolk Street was no longer a quiet home for an antiquarian. It had become a secular temple for the literary elite. Samuel Ireland, his father, walked through the rooms with a newfound pride that was almost painful to behold. He moved the furniture to accommodate the growing number of visitors who arrived at all hours, their heavy carriages rattling over the cobblestones outside. Among them was the legendary James Boswell, a man whose word carried the weight of the entire English literary establishment. William Henry watched from the shadows of the doorway as the portly, double-chinned biographer leaned over the display table, his breath heavy with the scent of hot brandy and water. Boswell squinted at the documents through a magnifying glass, his eyes wet with a reverence that bordered on the religious. The room was silent, save for the steady ticking of a tall clock and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the old man. Finally, Boswell sank slowly to his knees, his heavy frame groaning against the floorboards, and pressed his lips to the yellowed parchment of the forged deed. He whispered that he could now die contented, for he had lived to see the hand of the master. It was a moment of profound victory for William Henry, seeing the most brilliant minds of the age fooled by his soot and singed paper. Yet it was also a moment of mounting terror. The higher the pedestal was built, the further he would have to fall, and the lie was now growing larger than the boy who had created it. The final escalation was the most audacious act of his short life. To truly cement his place as the savior of English heritage, William Henry decided he must find more than a letter or a legal deed. He must find a lost masterpiece. He chose the legend of Vortigern, a 5th-century king of the Britons, drawing inspiration from the same historical chronicles the bard himself had once consulted. He worked in a fever, writing the lines first on modern paper in the quiet of the night to ensure the meter, and the drama held a semblance of the master's voice. Then, with painstaking care, he performed the grueling task of transcribing the entire 5 acts onto his precious, dwindling hoard of ancient parchment. He told his father the play was a discovery from the mysterious and fictional Mr. H., a man who supposedly possessed a trunk full of such treasures, but wished to remain anonymous to avoid the prying eyes of the public. This invisible benefactor became the perfect shield for William Henry's inventions. The lie was now a living thing, a sprawling architecture of ink and ancient dust that demanded more and more of his life every day. He felt the weight of the 17th century pressing down on his shoulders, even as he prepared to hand over the manuscript that would eventually lead him from the quiet study in Norfolk Street to the grand, candle-lit stage of the Drury Lane Theatre. The ink was barely dry on the tragedy of Vortigern, but the real tragedy was already beginning to unfold in the silence of his father's house. The house on Norfolk Street was no longer a mere residence. It had become a cathedral of paper and ink. Samuel Ireland moved through the dim hallways with the measured, reverent pace of a high priest. To him, the air itself seemed to vibrate with the presence of the ghosts his son had summoned. In the center of his study, the mahogany table was draped in heavy, forest green velvet, providing a stark contrast to the pale, fragile sheets of parchment that lay atop it. Every morning, Samuel would enter the room while the London mist still clung to the window panes like a damp shroud. He would light a single tallow candle, watching the flame dance and cast long, flickering shadows against the walls lined with thousands of leather-bound volumes. The scent of the room was a thick, comforting mixture of beeswax, old tobacco, and the slightly metallic tang of the special ink William Henry claimed to have found. Samuel would run a trembling finger just above the surface of the documents, never touching the ink itself, as if afraid the sheer weight of his devotion might smudge the divine words of the bard. He believed, with a fervor that bordered on the holy, that he was the chosen guardian of England's greatest lost treasure. This was the era of 1795, a time when the world was hungry for the tangible touch of genius, and Samuel was more than willing to feed that hunger. He saw the scrolls not as legal instruments or letters, but as physical extensions of William Shakespeare's very soul, and he felt a quiet, simmering triumph that his son, the boy he had once dismissed as a dullard, had been the one to bridge the gap between the centuries. As word of the discovery rippled through the coffee houses and salons of London, the quiet of Norfolk Street was shattered by the rhythmic clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones. Samuel decided to open his doors to the public, establishing a ritual that occurred every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, from the hour of noon until 3 in the afternoon. A line of the city's most distinguished figures began to snake down the Strand, all waiting for a glimpse of the impossible. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with hushed whispers and the rustle of silk coats. Among the many who climbed the stairs was James Boswell, the legendary biographer of Samuel Johnson. By this time, Boswell was a man of fading health, his movements slow and his frame portly. Yet the promise of these manuscripts seemed to ignite a final, desperate spark within him. He sat in Samuel's study, the light from the tall windows catching the silver in his hair, and held the papers up to the lamp with shaking hands. To steady his nerves, he requested a glass of warm brandy and water, gulping it down in great, rhythmic swallows between his inspections. For hours, he scrutinized the florid penmanship, his breath hitching as he read the so-called profession of faith. Finally, overwhelmed by the sensory weight of the moment, Boswell lowered his heavy bulk unsteadily to the floor. He knelt upon the cold floorboards, his eyes wet with tears of relief, and pressed his lips to the topmost page of the collection. "I shall now die contented," he breathed into the silence, "since I have lived to witness this day." It was a moment of absolute surrender, a testament to the power of a lie when it is wrapped in the clothing of a dream. Samuel reveled in this adulation, feeling his own social standing rise with every signature added to his certificate of belief. This document, a testament to the authenticity of the find, soon bore the names of poets laureate and peers of the realm. Even royalty was not immune to the lure. The Duke of Clarence and the Prince of Wales expressed their profound interest, with the Duke visiting the house to marvel at the tactile artifacts. There was a lock of dark hair, supposedly belonging to Anne Hathaway, tied with a silken thread that looked appropriately aged. There were sketches and drawings, and a letter from Queen Elizabeth herself, written in a hand that seemed to possess the regal authority of the Tudor age. Samuel's friend, Sir Frederick Eden, an expert in the study of old seals, had examined the wax impressions with a magnifying glass, concluding that the strange image beneath Shakespeare's signature was a quinton, a revolving target used by knights. To the believers, this was a clever play on the name Shakespeare, a shaking of the spear that served as a secret mark of the man himself. The textures of the papers were intoxicating, the rough, uneven edges of the parchment, the way the ink had faded to a perfect, ancient brown, and the slight, musty odor of the trunks from which they had allegedly emerged. To Samuel, these were not items to be questioned. They were relics to be worshipped. He saw no reason to doubt his son's story of the anonymous gentleman known only as Mr. H., a phantom benefactor who lived in a house filled with forgotten history. The father's devotion acted as a shield, deflecting the first arrows of suspicion that were beginning to fly from the more cynical corners of London. But beneath the surface of this public triumph, a shadow was beginning to stretch. The literary elite of London were not all as easily moved as the weeping Boswell. Edmund Malone, perhaps the most formidable Shakespearean scholar of the century, remained conspicuously absent from the gatherings at Norfolk Street. From his own library, Malone watched the growing fervor with a cold, analytical eye. He did not need to kneel or drink brandy to recognize the signs of a forgery. He understood the evolution of the English language, the specific way spellings had shifted over the decades, and the exact chemical nature of Elizabethan ink. While Samuel was hosting his exhibitions, Malone was beginning the monumental task of deconstructing the lie, piece by agonizing piece. The pressure began to mount as whispers of Malone's skepticism reached the ears of the visitors. Some started to notice that the Earl of Leicester's signature was attached to a document dated 2 years after his death. When confronted with this, Samuel and William Henry simply shrugged, claiming the document must have been misdated by a clerk of the time. This unwavering, almost blind defense only served to infuriate the scholars who prized accuracy over sentiment. The air in the house on Norfolk Street grew heavy with an unspoken tension. Samuel felt the walls closing in, the weight of his own reputation now inextricably tied to the sheets of paper on his table. He began to lash out at the critics, accusing them of professional jealousy and a lack of aesthetic soul. He was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, holding a bundle of lies and calling them the truth, while the cold wind of reality began to howl around him. Through it all, William Henry watched his father with a mixture of terror and dark fascination. The boy had started this to win a moment of affection, a single nod of approval from a man who had always viewed him as a disappointment. Now he found himself trapped in a cycle of production, forced to create ever more elaborate forgeries to sustain his father's ravenous pride. The domestic life of the Irelands became a strange, silent play. In the evenings, Samuel would sit by the fire and read the newly discovered lines of the tragedy Vortigern aloud, his voice thick with emotion, while William Henry sat in the shadows, his hands stained with the very ink that was fueling his father's delusion. Samuel truly believed his son was too simple-minded to have orchestrated such a grand deception. In his mind, the boy was merely a vessel, a lucky finder's fee for the universe. This perceived stupidity was William Henry's greatest protection and his most painful cage. As the winter of 1795 turned toward the spring of 1796, the father's devotion reached its zenith. He announced that the lost play, Vortigern and Rowena, would be performed at the Drury Lane Theatre, the most prestigious stage in the world. He was inviting the entire city to witness the resurrection of Shakespeare. But as the carriages continued to line up outside, and the elite continued to scrutinize the parchment under their lamps, the ticking of the clock grew louder. The sanctuary of Norfolk Street was about to be breached by the one thing Samuel Ireland could not engrave or ink into existence: the cold, unyielding light of the truth. In the damp, lingering chill of the London spring of 1795, the air inside the lawyer's office, where William Henry spent his days, felt heavy with the scent of wet wool and wood smoke. Outside, the gray fog pressed against the window panes like a living thing, but inside, a different kind of shadow was stretching. William Henry sat hunched over a desk that was cluttered with the debris of the past. His fingers, stained permanently with the dark ghosts of ink, moved with a rhythmic, frantic precision. He was no longer merely copying deeds or stitching together fragments of correspondence. He was breathing life into a monster. Under the flickering glow of a single, sputtering tallow candle, he was composing an entire 5-act tragedy. He had titled it Vortigern and Rowena. To create the physical vessel for this grand deception, he had scavenged blank pieces of parchment from ancient rent rolls, carefully cutting away the sections that bore no writing. He treated the surface with a mixture of bookbinder's chemicals, a pungent, sharp-smelling concoction that mimicked the slow rot of centuries. When he held the wet ink near the candle's flame, it turned from a fresh, vibrant blue to a brittle, exhausted brown, the color of a secret kept too long in the dark. When William Henry finally presented the completed manuscript to his father, Samuel, the atmosphere in the house on Norfolk Street shifted. It was as if the very walls had been waiting for this moment. Samuel did not merely read the pages, he worshipped them. He held the parchment with trembling hands, his eyes watering as he traced the forged signature of William Shakespeare. To explain the sudden appearance of such a monumental treasure, William Henry spun a delicate web of fiction. He told his father of a mysterious benefactor, a man he referred to only as Mr. H. This elusive figure, according to William, was a wealthy gentleman who had discovered a massive, brass-bound chest filled with ancestral papers. Finding that William Henry was a lover of antiquity, the generous Mr. H supposedly allowed the boy to take whatever he pleased. In reality, the only chest that existed was the one inside William Henry's own mind, a repository of desperate creativity and mounting terror. Samuel, blinded by his own lifelong obsession, never thought to question why a wealthy stranger would simply give away the literary find of the millennium. Instead, he invited the world to witness his triumph. Soon, the narrow hallway of their home became a pilgrimage site for the elite of London. The sound of heavy carriage wheels and the rhythmic clip-clop of horses on the cobblestones echoed through the house from dawn until dusk. Dignitaries, scholars, and the curious public paid their fees to enter the room where the manuscripts were displayed on velvet-covered tables. The air in the exhibition room was thick with the smell of expensive perfumes and the rustle of silk gowns. William Henry would stand in the corner, a silent observer of his own success, watching as men like James Boswell knelt before the papers, overcome with emotion. It was an intoxicating and terrifying sight. The more the public believed, the more the lie grew, feeding on the collective desire to find something lost. The whispers grew into a roar, and soon the literary world demanded that these new words be heard not just in a private home, but on the grandest stage in the kingdom. The play of Vortigern was no longer a secret between a father and a son. It was a prize that the great theaters of London were prepared to fight for. The competition for the rights to the play was fierce, but it was Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the manager of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, who emerged victorious. Sheridan was a man of grand appetites and even grander debts. He had recently rebuilt his theatre into a cavernous, magnificent space capable of holding over 3,600 people, and he was desperate for a spectacle that would fill every seat. When he sat down to negotiate with Samuel Ireland, the room smelled of port wine and expensive tobacco. Sheridan, a seasoned playwright himself, looked over the verses of Vortigern with a keen, cynical eye. He noted that the writing was somewhat crude, perhaps a bit clumsy for the Bard of Avon, but he pushed his doubts into the back of his mind. He told himself it must be a very early, unrefined work from Shakespeare's youth. The allure of the name was too great to ignore. He agreed to pay the Ireland family £300 up front, a staggering sum for the time, along with a promise of half the profits from every performance. The contract was signed in a room filled with shifting shadows, sealing a deal that would either make their fortunes or destroy their names forever. As the news broke that Drury Lane would host the premiere of a lost Shakespearean masterpiece, a fever took hold of the city. But beneath the surface of the excitement, the first cracks in the foundation were beginning to show. At the theater, the legendary actor John Philip Kemble was cast in the title role of Vortigern. Kemble was a man of stern, classical sensibilities, and as he began to memorize the lines, he felt a cold knot of suspicion tightening in his chest. The words did not taste like Shakespeare. They were hollow, lacking the internal music and complex depth of the works he knew so well. He voiced his concerns to Sheridan, but the manager was too deep in debt to turn back. The machinery of the great theater was already in motion. Sets were being painted, costumes of heavy brocade and faux fur were being stitched, and the public was clamoring for tickets. William Henry watched from the wings of the empty theater during rehearsals, his heart thumping against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked out at the vast sea of empty seats, imagining them filled with thousands of eyes, all waiting to judge the words he had written in secret by the light of a dying candle. The king's new words were about to be spoken, and the silence of the theater felt like the breath of a storm held in check. The evening of April 2nd, 1796, arrived with a heavy, damp chill that clung to the cobblestones of Catherine Street. Outside the towering walls of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, horse manure, and the expectant sweat of thousands. Carriages rattled and groaned, their iron-rimmed wheels striking sparks against the stones as they jostled for position. The new theater, a massive limestone monument designed by Henry Holland, loomed over the crowd like a cathedral of art, its grand pillars casting long, flickering shadows under the light of handheld torches. Inside, the great hall was a sea of velvet and silk, but beneath the finery, there was a jagged edge of tension. Rumors had been swirling for days, fueled by the scathing pamphlets of the scholar Edmund Malone, who had publicly branded the upcoming play a fraud just 48 hours prior. Yet the allure of a lost Shakespearean masterpiece was a siren song too powerful to ignore. The people crammed into the pit, their bodies pressed together in the dim, tallow-scented warmth, while the socialites in the private boxes fanned themselves with nervous energy, their eyes darting toward the heavy, gold-fringed curtain that hid the mystery of Vortigern. Backstage, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. The smell of grease paint and scorched candle wicks filled the narrow, winding corridors. John Philip Kemble, the most celebrated actor of his age, stood before a tall, tarnished mirror, adjusting the heavy, faux medieval robes of the titular king. His face was a mask of professional stoicism, but his eyes betrayed a deep, simmering resentment. He had spent weeks rehearsing lines that felt like lead in his mouth, clumsy, rhythmic failures that lacked the celestial fire of the bard. Beside him, the absence of his sister, the legendary Sarah Siddons, was a loud, echoing void. She had conveniently succumbed to a mysterious illness just days before, a tactical retreat that left Kemble to face the wolves alone. The young forger, William Henry Ireland, paced the wings, his hands trembling so violently he had to tuck them into his coat. He watched the stagehands move with practiced indifference, unaware that they were preparing the gallows for his reputation. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a heartbeat, every whisper from the audience a premonition of the storm to come. The curtain rose with a slow, agonizing groan of pulleys, revealing a set meant to evoke the ancient, misty heaths of Britain. As the first lines were spoken, a hush fell over the 3,000 souls in the auditorium. They listened with a desperate, straining intensity, wanting to believe, wanting to be the first generation in 2 centuries to hear new words from the ghost of Stratford. But as the first act bled into the second, the magic failed to take root. The language was a strange, hollow imitation. It had the shape of Shakespeare, but none of the blood. The audience began to shift in their seats, the rustle of silk and the soft murmur of confusion growing like a rising tide. The actors moved through the scenes with a visible, stiff discomfort, their voices ringing out into the vast space only to be met by a cold, analytical silence. In the pit, the skeptics began to lean forward, their faces illuminated by the footlights, watching for the moment the facade would finally crack. The air grew heavy with the weight of a collective realization. They were not witnessing a resurrection, but a wake. The breaking point arrived in the 5th act, a moment etched forever into the annals of theatrical disaster. Kemble, as the doomed King Vortigern, stood center stage, the flickering candlelight catching the silver embroidery of his gown. He reached the line that would become the hoax's epitaph. With a calculated, agonizingly slow delivery, he spoke the words. "And when this solemn mockery is o'er," he paused. The silence in the theater was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Kemble, perhaps sensing his own career hanging in the balance, repeated the line with an even more sardonic, knowing emphasis, his voice dripping with a subtle, icy disdain that signaled to the crowd exactly what he thought of the script. The effect was instantaneous. A single, sharp bark of laughter erupted from the pit, followed by another, and then another, until the entire house was consumed by a roar of derision. The solemn mockery had become literal. The illusion shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, and for 10 minutes, the play was drowned out by a gale of mocking hoots and whistles that shook the very foundations of Drury Lane. Chaos descended as the final scenes were hurried toward a desperate conclusion. In the upper galleries, fistfights broke out between those who still clung to the hope of authenticity and those who felt insulted by the amateurish deception. The actors, now barely hiding their own amusement or embarrassment, raced through their lines as if fleeing a burning building. When the curtain finally fell, it did not drop to applause, but to a cacophony of groans and the thud of discarded fruit hitting the stage. William Henry Ireland fled into the night, the sound of the laughter following him like a physical blow through the stage door and into the dark, rainy alleyways of Covent Garden. Behind him, the great theater began to empty, the spectators spilling out into the midnight air, talking loudly of the farce they had just witnessed. The dream of a lost Shakespeare had vanished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a 19-year-old's ambition. The candles were extinguished one by one, leaving the stage in a deep, hollow darkness, where the echoes of the solemn mockery still seemed to vibrate in the velvet curtains. The air in London during the spring of 1796 was thick with more than just the usual coal smoke and river mist. It carried the heavy, electric scent of a collapsing dream. In the quiet, wood-paneled study of the scholar Edmund Malone, a different kind of storm was brewing. Malone was a man of meticulous patience, a man who lived among the ghosts of the 16th century as if they were his neighbors. For months, he had watched from the periphery as the city fell under the spell of the Ireland family. While others wept over forged love letters or knelt to kiss scraps of stained parchment, Malone had been sharpening his pen like a surgeon's scalpel. He sat surrounded by massive, leather-bound folios, the candlelight catching the silver in his hair as he turned the pages of his massive work. It was titled An Inquiry into the Authenticity of Certain Miscellaneous Papers, and it was nearly 400 pages of absolute, scholarly destruction. He didn't just guess that the documents were fakes. He proved it with the cold, rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. He pointed out words that had not existed in the days of Elizabeth I. He noted the clumsy, forced loops of the handwriting that looked nothing like the fluid, rapid script of a man who wrote for the stage. As his pen scratched across the paper, the sound was soft, yet it was the death knell for the most audacious literary hoax in history. The truth was coming, laid out in black ink on white paper, as unyielding as the stone of Westminster Abbey. While Malone's book circulated through the coffee houses and salons, the atmosphere inside the Ireland home on Norfolk Street had turned cold and hollow. The vibrant, bustling energy that once filled the rooms, the lines of eager visitors, the smell of celebratory tea, the hushed whispers of awe had evaporated. In its place was a heavy, suffocating silence. Samuel Ireland sat in his armchair, his fingers tracing the edges of the very manuscripts that were now being called into question. His face was a mask of stubborn, desperate belief. He looked at the parchment, feeling the rough texture under his thumbs, and he simply could not, or would not, see the fraud. To him, these papers were a bridge to the genius he worshipped. To admit they were false was to admit that his own son had made a fool of him before the entire world. In the shadows of the hallway, young William Henry watched his father. The boy who had started this entire masquerade to win a single look of pride now realized that the pride was the only thing holding his father together. The guilt must have been a physical weight, a pressure in his chest that made every breath feel shallow. The house felt like a tomb of paper, a place where the walls were lined with lies that had once seemed like miracles. The smell of the old trunk, that scent of dust and manufactured antiquity, now felt like a rot spreading through the family name. The breaking point arrived not with a shout, but with the scratching of a single quill. In late 1796, William Henry Ireland sat down to write his full confession. Imagine the scene. A small room, perhaps lit by a single guttering candle that cast long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The young man's hand likely trembled as he dipped his pen into the ink pot. He began to recount the truth, word by painful word. He described the chemicals he had used to age the ink, the way he had held the wet paper over a candle flame to turn it a brittle, golden brown. He detailed how he had sliced the blank flyleaves from ancient books to ensure the parchment was truly old. He wrote of the fictional Mr. H., the mysterious benefactor who had never existed anywhere but in his own desperate imagination. He titled his confession an authentic account of the Shakespearean manuscripts. It was an act of both cowardice and immense bravery. He hoped that by taking the full blame upon himself, he could shield his father from the accusations of complicity that were mounting in the press. He wanted to tell the world that Samuel Ireland was a victim a man whose only crime was loving a poet too much. But the truth, once unleashed, has a way of hurting even those it is meant to protect. The tragedy of the aftermath was that the confession failed to heal the rift. When William Henry presented the truth to his father, the elder Ireland did not embrace his son. He did not offer forgiveness. Instead, Samuel reacted with a chilling, heartbreaking disbelief. He looked at the boy he had raised and decided that William Henry was simply too dull, too uninspired, to have created such works. In a cruel twist of irony, the father's refusal to believe the truth was a final insult to the son's genuine, albeit misguided, talent. Samuel Ireland went to his grave in the year 1800, still clutching the belief that the papers were real, still insisting that his son was merely a liar trying to steal credit for a discovery he hadn't made. He died with his reputation in tatters, a laughingstock of the literary world, broken by a love for a ghost. William Henry was left to wander the margins of society for the rest of his life. He lived until 1835, writing minor novels and poems that never captured the public's imagination the way his lies had. He would sometimes visit taverns, showing off his ability to forge the bard's signature for a few coins or a bit of attention, a ghost of a man reliving his moment of greatest infamy over and over again. The legacy of the Vortigern hoax lingers in the quiet corners of libraries and the footnotes of history books. It serves as a reminder of how easily our desires can blind us. The scholars and the public didn't just see the papers. They saw what they wanted to see, a more personal, more accessible Shakespeare. They wanted a man who wrote love poems to his wife and professional letters to his peers. William Henry Ireland didn't just forge ink and parchment. He forged a mirror for an entire era's obsession. Today, those forged documents are still kept in museums, preserved as carefully as the real artifacts they once mimicked. They are artifacts of human longing, of the lengths a son will go to for a father's love, and the devastating power of a lie that becomes too large to control. As the story of the Irelands fades into the soft darkness, we are left with the image of a young man in a lawyer's office, the smell of old paper on his hands, dreaming of a world that would finally notice him. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.